Welcome, Dungeon Plunger Union members. I have my +1 plunger and a steaming hot cup of holy water blessed by St. Keurig. And today we have another Union member with us to help me plunge the dungeon and flush evil down the drain. Welcome, Che Webster.
Hello.
So, Che, you are the master, the man behind Roleplay Rescue, the podcast, the blog. Um, Tell us a little bit about yourself. What's the origin story of Che Webster and his role-playing career?
Hmm. I started wargaming at around about age 6 or something like that with my dad. Hex and chip tank battle games and stuff like that. And then a friend of mine, when we were in what would be middle school, I suppose, for you guys, we were about 7, 8 years old, something like that. A friend of mine, called Daniel, had a game called Traveller, which I have no idea where that came from. And yeah, we started like mucking around with that. We were really young. Um, by the time I was 10 years old, we kind of got Dungeons and Dragons. Weirdly, we got the Advanced Edition Monster Manual first, I think. And yeah, then through the years, we played Rollmaster and Star Frontiers and Palladium a bit, and I got into RuneQuest, where we never played it on all the years through to about 1989. So, and then basically I went to university and I played on and off, but not a lot. And it kind of continued through the 90s. I was collecting games and reading stuff, but not getting so much in the way of play because life took over, the way it goes. 1998, we moved to Nottingham, which is where I live now. And yeah, joined a club in Nottingham and I played some AD&D Second Edition, which was the very first time I played that game. And yeah, it kind of formed a little group. Played Alternity, played Dungeons and Dragons Third Edition, three and a half, four and five, and all the way through, kind of like just developing, like trying out lots of different things. So I've been playing on and off for what, 45 years or something stupid. That's the origin. And yeah, the podcast kind of started in 2018 because I was so frustrated because I was losing players. At the time, I thought it was actually their fault. I thought it was that, they're letting their lives get overtaken, having kids and stupid things like that. But actually, what it turned out was I was just such a crap GM that they were abandoning ship, and it turns out that, yeah, it was all me, which might be true. Anyway, there I am. I was raging in 2018. And yeah, we formed this little community around the podcast, which has become, big part of my life, actually, really important. And I think, about 2020, 2021 probably saved my life, because I got into a very dark place. And I think it's the hobby community that kind of pulled me out of that very dark place. So there you go. Origin stories are boring, so we should keep them short.
Well, I think that's a great origin story, and there's a few things that I'd like to pick out of there. I mean, you're definitely, the reason or one of the reasons why I got into podcasting. I mean, I'd always had an interest in doing something like this, but you were somebody who really encouraged me to go down this route and pursue it. So I really appreciate that. And you've built such a great community with the Roleplay Rescue um, Discord and whatnot. I can't remember. Do you need to join the Patreon to get on the Discord, or can you just get on the Discord as like that?
You kind of easiest way is being a patron, and then you just get access. It's supposed to happen automatically, but it doesn't always, which is really irritating. But the fact is, if you kind of get in touch with me and you want to kind of, spend some time with us, just asking politely, I'm usually going to let people in, you know. Because there's loads of friends on there. There's people I've met from around the internet, and people I've interviewed and stuff like that are on there and come and go. It's a kind of fairly open community. It's a small thing, right? For me, it's really important that it's a small thing, and it's just those people who are interested in what we are doing. And I guess what we are doing is trying to kind of keep the hobby going on the one hand, but also just get a little wee bit better at it, all the time. And if you want a community that's just what I found it to be is really supportive on every level. So like, yeah, about hobby, and that's all fun and encouraging, but actually on a personal level too. And there's a lot of really quite personal stuff that does go on in there. People shared like their, especially their anxieties, and I think that's a really important thing.
Yeah, it seems, I don't know if it's specific to the role playing community, but it feels like there's a lot of us that suffer from mental health issues and have dark thoughts. I know that I've been there, um, and I think that's one of the things that really draws people to listen to your show and be a part of your community is because you are so supportive of that, and we're able to talk about it without a sense of judgment and really um, be supportive of each other in the hobby. So I think that that's super special. And I think that's another thing. Like you're an authentic person. You're not trying to be anybody else except for who you are. And I think that really comes out on your show. And especially if you do get Patreon access to the Dungeon Master's diaries or journal. Um, like
GM journal.
DM journal. Yeah, my bad.
Sorry. It used
But
to
yeah,
be called the DM's Dungeon. Was it Dungeon Master's Diary? That's what it was originally. Yeah, but
so yeah, I feel like that's where you get the real talk. So, we get two sides, where we get a side of you where it's a much more personal and intimate look into your life and how you're dealing with things. And then on the other hand, we get the, you know, maybe more practical kind of how do we become better game masters? How do we become better players? And sometimes just better people. So, and
about
you
that.
do, and you have a lot of really good guests on to interview and stuff. And so it's really cool to be able to interact with those guests too on your Discord, which is something that I've really, really enjoyed. The other thing that you mentioned is that so you moved to Nottingham, and that was motivated by your taking a job for Games Workshop, right?
Yep. Yeah, so 1998. Yeah, I was a GW store manager down in Essex. And then they invited me to go up to Nottingham to run the Games Day shows. So I don't know if anyone people in the UK would know, but basically they had these big annual shows in Birmingham, which are around about 8 to 10,000 people would go to every year, once a year. Big kind of marketing event, really, and big sales stands there. And I got asked to come and kind of run it. When we started, it was a loss-making kind of marketing cost, really. But by the time we finished with it, we made it into a sort of lots of money making thing that Games Workshop rather liked. I think along the way, though, I learned an awful lot about teamwork. The thing about Games Workshop's Games Day show is that pretty much everybody's volunteered to help. So you have like 700 or so staff that are you're managing on that day, and you're the guy at the top kind of thing. Actually, what you have is a whole load of delegated teams, and they're all just keen hobby people who want to have a good time. Guys coming from retail stores around the country, bringing their customers up on coach loads, to come and play games in a big hall. You've got the whole kind of Games Workshop studio there. You had all of these things going on. Really, really cool, fun, and extremely intense day of gaming. And yeah, that was my job. And alongside that, I got involved in events generally. So I worked with Jervis Johnson, who's one of the game designers, to create the grand tournaments. And then we had the international grand tournaments for Warhammer 40,000, and other game systems like that. So yeah, loads of fun. And I did that through till about 2006. So it's a long while ago now. Um, but yeah, it was a big part of my life for a while. And again, really eye-opening. Great to go and spend time with all these great game designers and artists, illustrators, painters, everything, every part of that business you're sort of in touch with. It was just great, and to work with the founders as well. People like Rick Priestley, Jervis Johnson, great designers. Alessio Cavatore, one of the great writers. Gav Thorpe, and I mean, the list is endless, really. And if I'm missing people, please don't be offended.
So, what was some of the, or at least like one of the best sort of experiences that you had while you were there working in the company? Like there must have been some experiences where you were like, wow, I can't believe that I'm, getting an opportunity to be a part of this?
There are a few, yeah. Okay, play testing War Master, the 6 mil war game with Rick Priestley, and giving him feedback on a game. That was fun. Working with Mike Mason, who's now the line editor of Call of Cthulhu, with Chaosium. He back then we worked together. He came in and worked with the shows with me. He went on to get involved in the design of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay second edition. We worked on that. My group at home play tested that game. That was cool. 40K RPG got developed at that period during that period as well. All of these kind of really cool things. So there's bits of role playing hobby stuff that we sort of fought for. We brought back Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay guys between us because we just moaned at people a lot about the fact that it had gone away, and nagged them and bugged them. And I'm not saying that we caused it because we didn't. Someone made a proper decision to try and make some money out of it again. But it was fun to be part of. Going and spending time with Gav Thorpe and developing Battlefleet Gothic. Just playing games there. Did battle reports for White Dwarf. Done all sorts of stuff. I mean, it seemed like almost every week there was just something very cool that you got to do. People like badmouth that company. I don't. I just think it's his own thing. It's big pluses, big minuses. The evil empire is not quite as evil on the inside, but it's certainly a really cool kind of environment to work in. And I guess like for me, it was just a great honor all the way through. I have absolutely no kind of regrets in my time there. It's all good.
I feel like that's sort of what a lot of people would say about Wizards of the Coast, right? I think that there's probably a lot of people who worked on D&D in all its iterations who just loved the game, loved role playing, and wanted to, do good by the community. But, corporate overlords being what they are a different breed and hard to please. And so, decisions get made that aren't necessarily to the benefit of the fans of the game.
Yeah, I mean, the workshop certainly went through there's the whole bit where I was there in the early part in the early 90s when the business kind of came away from being owned by Ian Livingstone, and Steve Jackson was sort of bought out and became this kind of thing. And we went through it becoming a public limited company, and all of the changes that came there, and all the way through to the period when I left the company, when I was made redundant. Okay, so I could be bitter. Was the period where I feel like the accountants had finally taken over in quite a big way, and we're really driving like a lot of change. I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, but it felt like hard at the time, and it felt like we'd gone from this very amateur business to a very professionalized business. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it was a change. And yeah, I was just really pleased to be in that period where it was very much dominated by hobbyists, and it kind of like went through that arc of change, really. And that's the evolution of a lot of businesses if they're going to survive. I mean, that company is huge, and has just become a massive business, and it survived, and keeps the hobby alive. I mean, so many things. If you like toy soldiers and miniatures, basically you owe everything to Games Workshop. Really, all of the innovations, plastic miniatures, all of the kind of quality development and everything else, the paints, everything. There are lots of companies that are riding on the I think, are riding on the tail of that really, really beautifully. In the same way that so many people in our hobby ride on the tails of like Wizards of the Coast. So, um, I, yeah, I'm always hesitant to be critical of the business end, but it's not to say that I'm a big fan of big corporate kind of concerns either. I can understand why people are suspicious of that, and I do feel that there can be a disconnect between, the hobbyist kind of enthusiast within the company or around the company, and then kind of like those business goals and aims, and the public. You've got a shareholders to keep happy basically, and that is a reality.
Yeah, 100%. So after that, you ended up going to become a teacher. Is that correct?
Yeah, I actually went and did 4 years as a recruitment consultant, recruitment research and recruitment consultant, and then yeah, took a career change, became a school teacher. So I now teach religious education and secondary education in the UK, and this is the point where I have to be really careful what I say.
Yep.
Um, But yeah, I'm a school teacher. So those who can't teach, right?
Uh, I really I don't like that uh phrase. I feel like it underappreciates all the work that goes behind people who mentor the next generation. And I feel like I've had not all of my teachers, but I've definitely had some teachers in my life who have impacted me more than others and have really changed the direction of like how I think and what I've done. And so I don't know. I don't feel like it's fair to put some kind of a judgment on that, you know?
Oh, that's nice to say.
So
Yeah, you say so. I mean, the thing for me is, you know, I've been doing this 50, teaching 15 years now. And there's been a steady erosion in our culture of, of the educated person anyway, of being kind of respected. But I also think academia generally kind of under suspicion a lot of the time, maybe sometimes rightly so. But I do feel like when you're working with, teenage people, basically, young adults kind of working their way through, trying to pass on some kind of knowledge and wisdom to them. It's easy to feel unappreciated, especially in a society I mean, I don't know what it's like in America or Canada, but here in the UK, like, it's all on us. Whenever time something goes wrong, well, the schools better pick that one up,
yeah.
and, it's kind of getting a bit silly in some ways, I think, but like I said, I've got to be careful what I say. I love it though. I mean, I love working with the young people, teaching what I do. I'm passionate about what I do, and about how I do it as well. Actually, trying to be innovative, trying to be engaging with the kids and everything else. But in the end, um, you know, they take what they want to from it, really.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I worked as a caretaker in a school for a few years, and having my own kids and seeing the education system, and then family members who are teachers, and talking to others who are teachers that are friends of mine, and it's not something I think that's isolated to Britain. I think it's like a maybe a worldwide sort of issue. I'm not really sure where this attitude comes from that somehow we're putting all this pressure on teachers when it's should be sort of like a joint kind of joint mission, right? To elevate our kids to the next to where they need to go in life, and at least guide them in making their own decisions to do that.
Yeah, an ideal world is a triangle. There's a triangle between the teacher, the student, and the parents, and it's must be mutually supportive. It's kind of the way we look at it. Um, So, that's what we're trying to do all the time. I just wish sometimes people would be more trusting. But people are who they are, and then everybody's got their own baggage. So, you know, um, it's the way it goes.
You have been involved in a bunch of different school clubs promoting D&D and gaming and stuff like that. So talk a little bit about like what was your motivation to start a gaming club?
Let's get play games. Let's be honest. Right. Okay. So as a teacher, you're usually expected to do what's called an enrichment activity with students, right? So something that's going to add to their education, but isn't actually directly to do with like your subject, and everything else, right? So how can I enrich the lives of young people? What kind of activity can I get involved in? Let me see now. Rolling polyhedral dice. That would be kind of fun, wouldn't it? And teaching them to role play. Yeah, so I've done a bit of wargaming club stuff a little bit as well. But yeah, my background kind of go rewind back to Games Workshop. What was I doing in 2006? Well, at that point, we had a team of 10 people in the UK who were going out and they were working with community gaming clubs and school gaming clubs across the country. And GW was funding putting a lot of materials into school clubs. So one of the things I basically had this thing. I am gonna claim credit for this, and going into the UK, MD's office and going, look. we've got loads and loads and loads of great clubs around the country who, actually essentially like are fans who are going to do free marketing for us. We should support them. And then in terms of schools, if we were just to put stuff in the hands of school teachers, I bet you boots they'd get activities going. And again, it just becomes a free, well, not free, but it becomes a marketing opportunity, right?
Hmm.
So you want to take it from that point of view. But what we did is we took people out of retail, and like I said, over a period of 5 or 6 years, we built this little team who were going around, and then would sit down with people and give them what they needed, but also talk to them about how to best to get this off the ground. I wrote a guidebook on how to set up a gaming club. We had it published. We got it out. We gave it away to people, and we set up a network as well, the gaming club network, which was working with independent gaming clubs, just kind of getting them to work together. Get them to come and support games day, for example, by bringing along games and like, promoting what they were doing. We were promoting the clubs across the country. We had the networking sort of, where could you find your local club in the back of White Dwarf and all that sort of stuff going on. So that was a big part of something I believed in very passionately and made happen. And of course, once we had the cutbacks in 2006, it all kind of went, right. So, fair enough. It's 2010 and I'm becoming a school teacher. It's completely natural for me to sort of go, hmm, there's no game club here. Let's create one, and you find there are a few kids in the school who like are doing it. Um, at least that was the case when I first became a teacher. I think over time I found that that's less likely. In fact, what I'm finding now is that there are a lot of kids who have heard of it but not done it, that kind of stuff. And then with role playing games, it's like, Dungeons and Dragons is the brand people know, but it's not the game system that they associate with Dungeons and Dragons. It's the whole concept of role playing games is really what Dungeons and Dragons means to a lot of people. So yeah, taking that and making it real, sitting people, sit a bunch of kids down at a table and showing them how to play, or basically run a game for them, let them hand you how to play, and you'll be amazed at how quickly they'll take it and run it and do their thing. And I've been doing that, in the various schools I worked in over the years. Um, and all of it is just an excuse to sort of pass on what I love, really. So yeah, that is in essence what it is about. It's about like, saying, "Hey, kids, it's something I think is fun," and just put it in front of them.
So do you feel from the time that your days at Games Workshop promoting the hobby and then starting your first gaming club and then moving on to like various your various posts throughout your career, do you feel like the stigma behind gaming has changed and that it's easier now to start a gaming club than it was before? Or do you feel like you still encounter the same sorts of blockages of people where it's like, I don't know, man, that sounds like devil worship to me.
Yeah, I mean, there's less stigma now. I mean, people think it's geeky and like, but it's kind of geeky and a bit cute now. You get people like, oh, bless, oh, isn't it cute? Um, and it's sort of sometimes you can tell people don't know how seriously to take you when you start talking about, what you do. But yeah, the kids themselves are very, the ones that are curious and interested come. And again, it's really interesting. What I've noticed is, that you attract the students who I feel like most need what role-playing game hobby actually offers, which is really development of social skills. Um, we attract the neurodivergent in hordes, and also those people who don't feel like they fit into the general community of the school so well. So anybody who's kind of on a little bit fringe in terms of the way they see themselves or the way in which they're interested, what they're interested in, all that sort of stuff, tends to kind of gravitate in towards this little community. So that hasn't changed at all, as far as I can tell, since I was doing it. Way back when I was a teenager, we were a fringe group then. It's just that people are perhaps a little bit more tolerant of the fringes now. Like at least leave us alone. Um, I'm not aware that the kids are getting horrendously bullied for being, they don't hide it. They don't, that they're doing what they do. And in fact, I mean, in my present gaming club that we've got running, they very proudly, okay, this is going to sound geeky and sad, but, the GM of the Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition game, he turns up in a wizard's robe, with a hat, it is awesome.
That is
And
great.
others of them dress up, and there's a little bit of LARPy kind of feel to it all, which is just awesome. And like actually, I could not do. I mean, I would never have had the confidence to do that when I was 12, 13 years old, but they do, and it's kind of fun.
Wow, that is amazing though. Do you think that's like how much do you think like Harry Potter has had an influence on that kind of behavior?
Oh, it's got to have done, hasn't it? I mean, come on, seriously. I think there's a lot of things over the last sort of you think about the last 25 years or so, certainly since 2000. There's so many cultural shifts that have just made fantasy, especially, very much mainstream. Um, and we see this like Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition. We all understand that it's more of a mainstream brand now. Whether you like the game system and what have you, or what Hasbro stands for, any of that, you can't anything but admit that the brand's bigger, right? So
Yeah, I've had many occasions where people ask, "Oh, what are you doing this weekend?" And I'm like, "Oh, I'm gonna go and play some Dungeons and Dragons, even though I'm not playing Dungeons and Dragons," because they wouldn't
mhm.
understand, what some of these other systems are, like stars without numbers. What the hell are you talking about? Are you a astrologist or something? What would be the sort of kind of guidance that you would give somebody who wanted to start a school club, gaming club, or just a club that's not necessarily associated with a school?
Yeah, okay, if you're gonna like start up I mean, I've started my own face-to-face group kind of came out of setting up a meetup thing. That came as an encouragement through the Roleplay Rescue community, by the way. It's Simon from Legend of the Bones, for example, suggesting that I go with the meetup thing, and two or three other people in the community sort of saying, yeah, you should definitely do that. Try and try and kind of gather some players around you. I think the first thing is to sort of just generally speaking, find a space and a time and everything else, and then you just got to like promote that event as happening. I think that then all I've ever done every time is rock up with a game ready to go. Generally speaking, historically that has been so turn up with the D&D game. The most success I've had with newbies has basically been around using a really simple dungeon adventure kind of idea, something very simple and fantasy, probably pre-generated characters, and then just kind of getting guys around the table, outlining what role-playing games are and the fundamental idea that you're going to take on the role of a character in this fantasy world or whatever, set up a situation and go. I think probably the biggest inspiration, if you want a kind of good example of this, Matt Colville's original video on YouTube about like, today you're going to sit down and with your mates and you're going to run a game of D&D. That old video is great. It's actually exactly what I would recommend doing. That you just pull together a really small 5-room dungeon or something, sit down for whatever time you've got. We have an hour and a half on a Tuesday after school, and that's only an hour and a half because I've pushed the boundaries of getting the school to let us have more time in the evening.
Hmm.
And yeah, just game for a bit, and you will find that kids who like it will stay and hang around, and then the kids who don't will drift away, and that's okay. And then you just kind of keep going. The hardest thing is finding a set, GMs within the group, because at first you've got to drive it. You're going to be the one running a game. So persuading a kid to take it on, that's the next barrier, and that really is a case of saying it isn't actually that hard. You just need to start. So we're back to like your core theme, which is
Right.
just dive in, make a little dungeon. The guys know how to play, run them a dungeon. Um, and I'll be honest with you, I found the advice from the Alexandrians, so you want to be a game master. There's a very first opening chapter about how to run a dungeon. I just find that really useful. And those people who want a GM, we have a couple of copies of that book knocking around, and I always kind of just have a look through that, flip through that, if you want a bit of guidance, because again, it is accessible to someone who's about 11, 12, 13, 14, that age group. Um, I know Justin Alex, I have had him on the show and we've spoken about it. He wrote it with that in mind, his sort of 12-year-old self in mind. And
Right.
um, it is yeah, so it's a really good little guide as well. So yeah, I mean it was just that sit down, play a game. It's your enthusiasm in the end. If you bring enough energy to the table, it kind of rubs off on people, I think.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think I've definitely had game sessions where I feel drained at the end of the night because I feel like I've given. everything that I have, and the players were feeding off of that, and you feel you're exhausted, but you're like, oh man, that was good. Like that was a good session. So um I just wanted to kind of go back to what we were talking about earlier in your introduction about how gaming and role play rescue, the community had helped you through a dark period of your life. Could you talk to me a little bit about that and your experiences?
Yeah, okay. So like, the pandemic happened in 2020. Did you notice? Um, and
Strange. What is this
yeah.
pandemic you speak of?
So yeah, the COVID pandemic happened, and we went into lockdown in the UK, and then you have to understand I'm asthmatic. I actually was struggling with I had struggled with anxiety. I just didn't know I struggled with anxiety like very consciously, if you know what I mean.
Hmm.
But that whole period accentuated. And as we went back into schools, um, you know, on the one hand, we were being told, well, if you get if you're an asthmatic person and you get this kind of like disease, it's going to like completely like screw up your lungs and you will die or you will get very, very ill. So I had mental images of like, oxygen mask and little thing, with wheels behind me for the rest of my life if I got COVID. At the same time, I've been put in a classroom with like 30 kids, uh, socially distanced, I say with inverted commas. And then as the pandemic kind of the second wave of that came in, we were getting the stats that we got to the point where 50% of kids would be infected but show no symptoms, and then it got to 75% of kids. So the anxiety for me just became awful, and yeah, I had to go off work basically. I but I had a very dark moment where, yeah, suicidal ideation, I think is what they call it, right?
Hmm.
So, yeah, I've been in the worst places. But what was really interesting was how, I was podcasting, by the way, during this period, and then I kind of like, I remember, I don't really remember what I said, but I do remember sort of on the GM's journal, kind of like, I'm off work ill because, like, uh, um, and what was kind of wonderful was how through that I got therapy, and I was only off for probably about 12 weeks or something tops, and I was then kind of phased back into work, and I went on a course of CBT, and that was all great. By the way, the school's insurance kind of like paid for all of that, so I got lots of great support. But what also was happening was the community, and there's all the guys on the Discord kind of thing, because I think that was very much kind of like this ongoing daily kind of communication. We're just checking in, and it was just kind of like really cool. Um, and it was the ultimately those relationships that had formed up around gaming that kind of carried me through. Do you know what I mean? Like, I mean, yes, my wife, and yes, the therapist, and yes, kind of people, colleagues to some degree from work, but in the end, it's really like the guys in the community, and yeah, it's hard to sort of express really just how like somebody just checking in and saying, "Hey, you all right?" What difference that makes. Um, and when you sort of admit that you've been in the really dark places, when people just go, "Yep, cool, you all right?" is that is the best thing you can do, I think, for someone is just ask them outright, like how they are. Are you having have you been having the dark thoughts again?
Hmm.
Um, and that kind of stuff. And I learned a lot about, I mean, through that period as well, like I've been known to, um, support men's mental health charities. Um, so the whole kind of, what do they call it? The Tash thing. I've
Uh,
forgotten my head.
Movember.
Yeah, November. I got involved in like promoting that and in the follow up to that because I realized that men's mental health is like, well, men are dying earlier than women for no apparent reason. And that's kind of the fundamentals of it. Men's suicide rates are actually really alarmingly high. And through that experience, I kind of got to understand why. And I've had relapses because you will, and I
Hmm.
still do. And I feel like over the years, it's been 5 years now, but I'm still having relapses because you do. They hopefully get shorter and they get briefer, and you get better at spotting all the signs. But what's really helpful is that there are people in a community of gamers around me who, I'm in touch with largely daily somewhere on that, just ping it in. We've got a little channel in our Discord, which is Talking Minds, and I know I'm in a bad place if I want to type something in there negative, but I can't have the confidence to do so.
Hmm.
But I would really recommend that if you're like in a low place that you just tell somebody, right? You just
Right.
admit, type something and bing. What happens in our community is that you get loads of like huggy emojis and people going, "Yeah, I get it, man," and I'm all right, you're all right, and that kind of stuff. Which I don't know. There's a part of my brain that goes, "You're a narcissistic, attention seeking, piece of crap," but actually, what you are is a human being who needs to know that everything's all right, and you kind of need to say when you're in those dark places, I feel. And I think like there's nothing good comes from bottling it up as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
So yeah, so it's hard to quantify because it's not like any one individual or any in particular moment, or it's not like there's this great story of how, yeah, we got around a table and then I suddenly felt better. No, it's just that you guys turn up on it every other week. We get online on Saturday night, most fortnights, and we sometimes we play, and frequently don't play, but we just get on and chew the fat and have a conversation. You've been part of some of those conversations, so you know what I'm
Absolutely.
talking about.
Yep.
I now have a face-to-face group every other Saturday on the alternates, and that's a total lifeline for me. It's like the last 18 months has totally transformed my social anxiety, which is I have two diagnoses, general anxiety and disorder and social anxiety. I'm tackling the second one. The first one's sort of decreased somewhat. Um, and also that looks like, I mean, I don't have a formal diagnosis for ADHD, but it looks like that's kind of an element that's come out of this process as well. All of that though, um, all of the support that I've had from professionals has also been augmented by support from just everyday gaming folk who kind of get it, and many of whom struggle too. I think that's the important thing to say. They get it because
Hmm.
they suffer too, and yeah, I totally appreciate that. Like I feel like I'm Witcher now.
No, I feel like that's excellent. I was gonna say that while it didn't happen during COVID, but at the end of my nursing school, I basically had a nervous breakdown, and I felt a lot of those same feelings I think that you were feeling when, COVID was happening and you had yours. And to the same point where I did have that suicidal ideation. And I think that like one of the things that I took away from having conversations with you and our, the Discord was this sort of uh men are in a really strange place these days, I find. I feel like, especially your generation, but even my generation, kind of like the tail end, we grew up in this time period of where it was like, you got to be a man, like masculine man. And there were certain things that men do. And I think our hobby is kind of counter to that. This idea that, we never grew out of this, I want to play with the toy soldiers kind of phase, and that there's supposed to be something shameful about that. And I don't think that we should be ashamed of that.
Yeah, I remember. I'm just going to say this. Like my dad, all the time I worked for GW all the way through his years. When are you going to get a proper job? And then when I became a teacher, it was like, oh, you got a proper job, kind of. But yeah, there's this huge like like you're playing with toy soldiers for a living. How is that like a proper job kind of thing? Yeah, there was a lot of rubbish around. Like that business made a lot of money. And if you want to go at it from that, if you want to look at it from a corporate angle, it's like there's nothing to be ashamed of there. Um,
Right.
the share price says enough. Thank you very much. It's grown hugely. But yeah, still, playing with toy soldiers, how is that? So yeah, I get that. And I feel like there was, and when I was a kid, to be honest with you, there was a sense in which there was an effeteness to it, if I could use
Hmm.
that phrase, that it was seen as yeah, not manly stuff. I mean, I have no time for that macho stuff, but yeah, I had no interest in, I wanted to read texts of history, play war games, play role-playing games, read science fiction and fantasy books, and generally kind of like read philosophy and all that kind of stuff. I had very little interest in going into the woods, climbing mountains, going hunting, or any of that stuff. The only thing that was kind of vaguely manly for me was when I was a teenager, I joined the Air Training Corps, which is a part of the kind of a cadet thing for the Air Force, and I learned to shoot a rifle, and that was cool. But the only reason I did that really because it was just cool, right? Go to the range, and until firearms were banned in the UK, so great, and then that took that hobby away. You know, but going to a range and becoming a bit of a marksman with a rifle, that was fun. That's about it's about as blokey bloke as I get. I can't, there's basic stuff that I can't really do around the house. I have no idea how to do anything with a hammer, a chisel. I'm not very good with a paintbrush either, unless you want paint on your face.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something that I had to start teaching myself how to do because I was like, you know what? I'm not going to be intimidated by these things. I'm gonna watch some YouTube videos and ask some people for advice. And I think people are generally pretty good about that kind of stuff. But yeah, I get where you're coming from in that regard. Um, so you talked a little bit about your like online play, and now you have your face-to-face group. Do you have a preference to the face-to-face versus online play?
Yeah, I mean, there's a massive qualitative difference. I mean, the advantage of online play is you got access to the whole world. So, in theory, you should be able to find players. I still struggle finding players, probably because I'm that bad a GM. But the thing is that you've got access to the whole internet. So, essentially, if you can find the people that it gives you access to them, you can play with people all over the place. It's nice. I play with you and others from across the pond and around the world generally.
Hmm.
I had games with people in, sort of South Korea and Australia and everywhere, and that's great, except that you're doing it through, generally speaking, a camera and a microphone. Maybe you're using a virtual tabletop software or something, and that is qualitatively different from sitting in. So we go to the Nottingham Dice Cup Cafe, which is it's a basic kind of gaming cafe thing. They've got, we hire out a room. There is the main cafe area. Sometimes we go in there, but we basically hired a private room out these days for quiet. I got four guys who come regularly now. But sitting across the table with them, and in that human interaction where you're physically in proximity is different, and it's really hard to kind of explain it, and I wouldn't really care to try to, but it's just actually very different to sit, with people at the table. And we're pretty old. I mean, the guys I'm going with, there's one guy's a little older than me, and then the other guys are in their late 30s, I suppose. So, I'm in my 50s. So we're like, we're of an age. They're a little younger, but they're basically of an age. When we started playing, a couple of them had done a bit of 5e stuff and not much else, and I've been gaming for years. And one of the other guys who's a bit older he's been around, playing D&D since about what, 76 or 77 or something. So, there's a lot of experience in the room. Um, and yet we still had to learn as a group of people to sit down together and interact together and
Hmm.
gotta get a game going. So I massively look forward to those sessions. And I think part of the reason is what one of my friends who comes to that session, the older guy, is called James. He said it's really grounding. I think that's a really great phrase. Like it's like in the way that you earth electricity. Do you know what I mean? Like it kind of
Hmm.
brings you back down to reality to sit in a room with people and roll polyhedral plastic things and scribble with pencil on a piece of paper. Because we do that. We're very analog in that group. Um, which would probably maybe strike a lot of modern players as quite odd, but it's not a nostalgia thing either. We just like the physical, kind of tactile nature of that. Um, but equally, I enjoy playing online because I've, got access to all of those different people. The difficulty with online play is like how to keep it in the realm of the imagination without, if you're using online tools, there's always this risk that the thing becomes about the online tool, and the attention's always on the virtual tabletop or whatever else is going on. So recently, we stripped it right back in the games I've been running. I let people roll real dice, and they can tell me if they succeed or fail, and I'm going to trust them. And they might all have a paper character sheet actually, or they might have a digital one, but it doesn't really particularly matter. And we're using voice and camera because trying to make that connection.
Hmm.
And um the difficulty is attention. I can play for twice as long face to face and be half as tired. I don't know what it is about like this format, what we're doing right now, talking online, but it is extremely tiring. So um, maybe if you grew up with that, it's easier. I didn't. So
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I wonder about that now that you bring that up. So you've been very vocal about your experimentation in terms of like prepping your games, and you have even written a book called Tiny Prep with for John Four and his company. Um, Talk to me a little bit about prep for you and how has that's evolved and where do you feel like you're at now?
yeah, well, again, this goes back. I mean, this is one of those things that the show has kind of tracked because basically, what Roleplay Rescue is a kind of personal diary of one insane GM. You know, like I started out, it was, my belief was that the GM needed to have everything prepped down to the detail, and I wasn't actually very good at prepping anyway, and so I'm a pretty okay improviser, but I didn't trust myself as an improviser and all that kind of stuff back then. So over the years, I kind of like I got really stressed and anxious and tense about what I was doing. I lost all the fun, really. Um, but more recently, what I've discovered is a number of things. So again, through that pandemic experience, one of the books that I read was a book called Tiny Habits, okay, by BJ Fogg. And if you haven't read Tiny Habits by BJ Fogg, no matter whether you're a gamer or not, you should absolutely read that book. He's the director of psychology, I think, at Stanford University, or he was, and it's all about like developing really, developing habits, why you should develop habits, and you should try and get rid of old ones that are really unhelpful, but like how to build them. And the theory of that is awesome. So Tiny Habits gave birth to Tiny Prep because all I did was take those principles and sort of go, how can you do that as a gamer? And his the big principles really are about if whatever you want to kind of create a habit, you just got to make the smallest version of that habit that you possibly can and slot it into your day, anchored to another really kind of solid habit that you already have, and then identify like the point at which is you can like, kind of lock on your new habit to the old thing. So, for example, I have a habit where, or had, sorry, a habit where I would do my blog daily. And so, like, I would sit at my computer and I'd do my blog, and then I set up this habit where as soon as I finished the blog, I published the blog, then I would prep something. Okay. And my prepped and the tiny prep thing, what I did is I created a little D6 table which gave me like things to prep, like an NPC or a place or a magic item, or as I was doing fantasy games at the time, or the name of a bat, the name of a monster or something like that, right? And um, you spend a little bit of time prepping something, one thing. And then, of course, to make that really work, you need to make it the smallest possible thing. So I discovered this technique of like essentially naming things. Like the name of a town or the name of an NPC or the name of an item or the name of a place or the name of anything in your world that you just kind of create and you make a list of. And then, of course, later on, when you've got a little bit more time, what you can do is you can go and take one of those things and like flesh it out a little bit. The next step for me was always just like write a sentence or two about it, you know,
Hmm.
so descriptively. And then, like when I'm writing, I'm putting something together for an adventure, like I need an item. I'll look at my tiny prep list of items. Oh, what have we got? Oh, that sounds cool. And I've got a bit of a description. Let's nick that and then stack that up and put it in my game. And what I found is just by having this kind of pool of ideas that I was generating daily. So the idea is that every time I did my blog at the end of the day, I created one more thing. That's 7 things a week. That's like 30 things a month. That's like 365 things a year.
Yep.
That really builds up. And and because I didn't want to think about it, because at the end of the day I was always tired, made it a D6 table so I could pick something. But if I really was stuck, it's like grab D6, roll dice. Oh, that's oh, an NPC. Right, okay, And that's the essence of it. And when John kind of talked to me, like he loved this idea when he sort of talked about writing a book about it, we just kind of figured out that we kind of created these little stat templates, really. John Four is, the role playing tips guy.
Yep.
He's big on kind of having like these little stack cards, little blocks. So what we're doing is like taking the an idea and then like the next step would be flesh it out, a little stack block. And the book has like a few of these little examples. They're quite simple. But what they do is just let you sort of descriptively pin down something, and then it's sitting there ready to be used in a game. And that's been really, really helpful. The next step from there for me has been like realizing that there's a gap between being the game master and the scenario designer. Aha. So this idea that you're going to set up a situation, I learned from Justin Alexander to not prep plots, but to prep situations, or if you like, a scenario. Justin Alexander in So You Want to Be a Game Master gives you scenario structures, which are, like essentially like how to run a dungeon location crawl kind of thing, or a hex crawl, or a mystery, or a raid. All of these different kind of scenario types that you can have in a game of any genre, by the way. Taking those and building scenarios around those kind of like structures made prep really interesting, really fun, and realizing that the GM is the guy at the table running the game on the day. But then in my head, kind of, this is really recent, but in my head, kind of going, damn it, the scenario designer, and I got this term really and this idea from the Angry GM. You can see how eclectic I am, right? I pay attention to everybody out there and
Hmm.
I just try and pull it. His point is, like when you're sitting down, put a different hat on. You're the scenario designer. Your job is to give the GM everything they need to run the scenario, and you kind of like pull together all the places, people, situations, items, and you make sure that they've got everything at their fingertips ready to go. So that when I turn up at the table as a GM, I put my GM hat on, I've got everything in front of me and I can riff off that and improvise. But in the end, I've got the core of it right in front of me. And
Mm.
I found that really powerful, this separation of roles in my mind. And the third part of that, by the way, is realizing that I'm not a system designer. What I mean is a rules writer. Like, so I've learned to just trust the rule set I've chosen and if I need to create something, rules wise, I can. But again, that's a different hat, like so a different problem to solve. And actually, I don't enjoy that as much as I actually enjoy creating these situations that are, what's going on, and I got a
Right.
big buzz out of that. So suddenly, prep becomes fun because I've got a load of hooks I can just grab. Now I'm the guy who gets to create the module, if you like, if you look at it that way. I'm a scenario designer, and I don't have to worry about I'm trying not to think about how I'm going to run it at the table. I'm just thinking about have I given the guy who's got to run this at the table everything they need, bearing in mind that it's me.
Hmm.
But yeah, actually, like it tends to make me write more complete notes in one level, but I actually really enjoy that process and it helps me iron out all sorts of stuff. And then in between sessions, by the way, what you can do is you can take this, you can go back to the scenario designer and go, yeah, that was working fine, but what about this? And then
Mm.
you kind of go solve that with the other hat on instead of being a GM. So the GM then becomes the guy who can turn up on the day knowing they've got a scenario in front of them, they've got the rules they can trust, they've got everything they need to do it, and they can just sort of sit there very chilled and run the game for the guys. Um, that has been a transformative kind of mental rearrangement, really. Instead of seeing the GM job as one big, huge task, it's now broken into pieces. There's this ideas making process, there's this scenario designing process, and then there's the running it out of the table process.
Mm. Yeah, that's really profound. I hadn't really, I mean, I've heard you talk about this before on obviously on Roleplay Rescue and your GM journal, but to have it broken down like that really makes a lot of sense to me because I think that's how I've been thinking about it is that yeah, there's all these little components that go into it, but I never really considered about like, okay, at this point in what you're doing, you need to focus on this area, which isn't necessarily going to be the same thing that you're going to need your mental power for at this point. So to break it into those discrete chunks, I think is actually like a really good way of um, organizing your thoughts and probably being a little more productive and not being so overwhelmed by the task.
Yeah. Another good tip on, by the way, on scenario writing from the Angry GM, angrygm.com, by the way. If you can get through all of his hyperbole, and the swearing and everything, he's great. But one of his is this the split between big prep and little prep. So what he talks about with scenario design is big prep, which is like, what's the big ideas? What's this scenario about? And he kind of says like, I'm a little bit more suspicious of this, but he's kind of like write out what you think might happen, kind of as a bit of a narrative. 'Cause to me, it was really close to sort of setting up a plot. But actually, the process kind of like works. Well, what would the players be doing? Like, if you in this scenario, if they're going to go to the dungeon to get the MacGuffin, like, how does that play out? What do you expect? What kind of things are you expecting to see there? And then taking those bits and breaking them down, the connective tissue of that, and kind of like then you do the little prep. The little prep is statting things and
Hmm.
deciding what the exact numbers for the thing is and all of that. So it's the bit where you take the game mechanisms, the rule bit, and you kind of marry it with your idea. And I found that really useful as well. This whole idea, I've got a scenario, I've written a scenario that can be used with any set of rules, and then I do the little prep, which kind of makes it for this rules. And to prove that works, by the way, I've run the same scenario for three different groups of people, exactly the same scenario with three different, completely different rule sets, and had three really cool games. So it's possible, and I think in some ways by breaking it in that way, you recognize that first of all, you've got to create a situation that's coherent and which is playable. Really, it's kind of like the players can work their way through whatever the goal is. There's a goal, and you've got a series of challenges they can try and work through. Okay, on that level, and then you're going to understand that the game mechanism bit that is you can interface with your rules is a sort of separate thing. Um, I used to get really hung up on like trying to come up with fair scenarios and balanced fighting encounters and all these starting with the mechanisms, which is like totally backwards. Start with a world, start with the situations you're putting your characters into, flesh all of that out and describe it, and then you can like bring in the bits of numbers that you need to
Hmm.
make that work at the table. Yeah, that's been really, really powerful as well. So it's just like dividing the work into like different chunks and different ways of thinking. Yeah. Um, Kind of cool. Oh, and if you are creating pre-gens, by the way, that's the put your player hat on and build really effective, exciting, interesting characters that you would like to play with, and then put them in front of people. Do you know? I mean, that's quite fun as well. Yeah, the current face-to-face game that we're running, I've got this After Ruin game set in a sort of post-apoc fantasy game, and I created the pre-generated characters as an option. I created character templates they could build their own characters with, and I also said you could just come up with a concept and we'll work it out. And in the end, they went with the pre-generated characters. And one of the bits of feedback I had is like, these are kind of cool. They're actually got. It's like, yeah, because I wanted to play them. Every single one of those six characters that I created, or seven actually characters I wanted to play. There's only four players. They've got seven characters to choose from. They discarded the ones that were the least interesting to them on a personal level. But for me, all of them were like, I'd like to play those. And I think again, if you're what you got to bring to the table are things that you want to play with. You know, um, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. If you had one piece of advice that you could give to a novice or a veteran game master, what would be that advice?
For the novice, It is. It's start. It's that whole thing of, go watch the Matt Colville video about like tonight you're gonna run a game. Literally, like decide I'm gonna run a game for my buddies, invite some buddies round, and then make yourself run a game. I just don't get hung up on it. Pick something that you feel like you would like to play, and then just run the damn thing. It'll be awful, as the angry GM says. It will be awful, and that's fine.
Yeah.
It won't be as awful as you think it is, actually, but it will feel awful, probably, like in some ways. But it'll also be really fun. And it's that thing you will know all the flaws, but your players don't necessarily notice that stuff. And I think you should just play. Matt Colville's original scenario was like a five-room dungeon with some goblins, like in a fantasy game.
Hmm.
There's nothing wrong with that. You know, it's an old hat thing, isn't it? We talk about classic Dungeons and Dragons and stuff. But if you want to play a sci-fi game, you want to play Stars Without Number, for example, then go make some characters, put together a quick location, room location kind of adventure, put a nasty beastie or something in there, go play with it. It's the same principle.
Hmm.
create a situation that interests you, go put some characters into it and see what happens is kind of what I would say. For the veteran, don't ever see yourself as a veteran is probably
Mm.
my view. I would there's the whole Eastern philosophy of beginner's mind, right? Just just kind of treat it all as as fresh as you can, I think. And again, I think the best bit of advice that I have received and have tried to plug into my head and in is one that I think you've heard people like on your show say a few times, which is like play the thing you really want to play. And even if you're not quite sure what the thing is that you would, because my problem is I don't really quite know what it is I want to do, but just play things that interest you and you'll find out, and yeah, just keep going. But the beginner's mind, like, never think you've got it nailed down because you haven't. Like, for all of that stuff I just talked about, that's all just where I'm at right now. You ask me in a month, I'll probably have something else to say, and it's that you're an evolving, changing person. And maybe the biggest mistake has been to try and think that, like, the hobby is one thing and that we as gamers are kind of at any point one thing. You stick labels on ourselves, about like what marketing labels and things like that get stuck on us, or we stick them on ourselves about what we are and who we are in the hobby and all that kind of stuff. The reality is that I don't fit any of those. I don't think you fit any of those. Nobody does really. Any taxonomy, any kind of labeling and description, it's for at best it's roughly describing something that you value, and secondly, it'll be temporary. So just don't stand still. Keep playing and mucking around and experimenting. And yeah, it's a hobby, right? It's supposed to be played with.
Yeah, no, that's fabulous advice. I really like that. Uh, so what's the future of Roleplay Rescue looking like? Do you have any sort of projects, plans in the future, or where are you at?
Where I'm at is kind of wondering what on earth the next episode is going to be, which is pretty much the way I've always been. This thing, I have no idea. I keep thinking I've come to the end, but then I do another episode, so maybe not. I do my show in series, and the interludes, they've always been when I kind of burned myself out, and then you kind of, oh, no, that's it, I'm done now. So there's loads of episodes with me going, well, this is it. See you guys, and then like 2 weeks later, hi, I've got another mad idea. So I have no idea. What I do think I'd like to work on, and I guess like maybe this is a sort of semi kind of announcement. I think there is a need for somebody to collate the variety of like different approaches to gaming that are out there in a sort of introductory guide to like all the different flavors on Anthony Boyd, he's the runeslinger from
Hmm.
Casting Shadows. He and I had a conversation a few weeks ago about what he calls the story divide, where a lot of people in the hobby community think that role-playing games are all about telling stories. That's one way of playing role-playing games. It's become the dominant way of thinking about role-playing games, but actually there are lots of other ways of thinking about role-playing games which aren't about telling stories. And I feel like collating those and collecting those might actually be a really useful thing to do. Maybe that's something that a longer term project of, taking all the things I've learned from all the people I've spoken to over the last sort of 7 or 8 years and all the things I've read, the hundreds, literally hundreds of role-playing game systems I've read, taking all of that, trying to distill out of it, like all that. I mean, obviously on any spectrum there's an infinite number of points, right? But maybe there are some big things that we could detail and share and what have you. And I feel like it would be better if it was a multi-author effort, and I feel like it would be better if it was a really community driven kind of effort.
Hmm.
And then so for me, like, maybe that's the thing to talk about or to write about or whatever is the best format. But I feel like, everything from those hardened story game guys all the way through to like the most, I don't know, the most kind of like fly by the seat of your pants, improv, emergent. I'm rolling random tables every 2 minutes, kind of like gaming style. All of those different variants. I've got, people like Daniel James who were playing with rules entirely behind the screen, and players never touched them. It's totally immersed in the other world. That kind of style. All of these different approaches. We've got the wargaming style, which has been, the OSR kind of approach that you've, recently been talking about as well. All of these different styles. I kind of feel like hobbyists need to know what's out there, and then more importantly how to begin those things and try those things out. And even if it's just a catalog of whose thing to go read, Maybe that's what it needs. Whose rulebook? You had Matt Finch on recently,
Hmm.
Father Godfather, the OSR, whose stuff do you need to go and read the quick gut primer to old school gaming if you want to get into that, right? So pointing people at that, there is this huge wealth, and I feel like somebody needs to catalog it. And it's bugging me more that it's not. Maybe it's uncatalogable. I don't know. It's just vast. But yeah, I'm concerned about, when people like you and I pass, will this stuff get lost and forgotten?
Mm.
Um, Lots has been lost and forgotten, and some things just keep going around the loop of discussion. But blogs are not forever.
Hmm.
Podcasts are not forever.
Nope.
Like anything on the internet is one kind of, electromagnetic pulse away from destruction. So, what is it that's going to preserve all of this knowledge? Because traditionally it's been passed down by word of mouth.
Right.
Um, but I don't know. That's the question that kind of keeps me up actually a little bit in the moment. And so, yeah, for me, I'm curious as to what people might have to say about that, whether they want to like champion that or whatever. Because if you've got a way of gaming that you love and like the question's got to be like, how are you passing that on? I pass on my love of it through like 12-year-olds at a school club, through the people I game with, and through a podcast. Um, is that enough? I don't know.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, and that's an interesting kind of subject to deal with. That sounds like a super challenge. I mean, I worry about that on a certain level too. I have a new group that I've been playing with, and I've been trying to sort of teach them sort of like a more of a philosophy of playing the game than being like bound to rules. And I
Hmm.
recently had a new player join us who had been playing fifth edition, and this guy is very much like a rules guy and a numbers guy. And up until this point, the players were just sort of kind of going by what felt right, what felt good for them playing the game. I hesitate to use the word story because that's a
Hmm.
contentious subject right now. But he very much was like calculating the odds of like, oh, okay, well, the monster has this percent of a chance to hit you based on what we've figured
Hmm.
out of the AC. And I was kind of like, ah, oh, dude, you're kind of ruining it for, you know, and that's, I mean, I suppose that's a legitimate way for him to play, right? I mean,
Hmm.
I'm not knocking it for him, but um like you have your style, I have my style, and we all have our own, sort of like even the way Matt Finch described it, and especially in that how he was shocked about the cinematic experience that one player wanted to have.
Hmm.
And I was kind of like, dude, you've been playing for a long time and you never encountered that before. Like I was like genuinely that I felt like that was a revelation moment for me during that interview where I felt like, okay, yeah, there's some different ways of looking at this game and playing this game, and trying to find where we fit into it isn't easy, So,
Yeah, I mean, there's just so many possibilities. I mean, like I prefer, I realize that any sequence of events that happens in play, when you look back on it, forms a narrative. And I'm really satisfied with that in terms of I tell the story after the game kind of thing, right? So
hmm
I love that. And I'm in it for the experience at the table. I mean, if I'm a player, I want to be my character and I want to be lost in the world and whatever is going on, the story emerges through that play, and I'm really into that. And that's a way of playing that has like become sidelined over many, many years. And what I'm discovering as I talk about it more is that people coming out of the woodwork going either, yeah, that's how I like to play, and I prefer to do that, or I didn't know you can do that. But
mm
equally, I remember Rinsling was telling me the other day, after our recent conversation about the story divide, he had someone come to him and say, you know what, I just want more game in my game. So like probably a bit like maybe a bit like the dude that you've got, like I want a bit more of the rolling the dice and moving the minis and things in
hmm
my game. And there's nothing wrong with that either. There's nothing wrong with any of it if that's your thing. I think the reality is though that not every player fits my table.
hmm
And not every player fits your table. I think just understanding and talking about your preferences, working out what your players' preferences are through how they play. And by the way, this is a great bit of advice from the Angry GM. Don't ask them because they haven't got a clue,
Yeah, I
really.
would agree with
Just
that.
watch how they play. And then so I've got a guy at my table, for example, who loves playing with the minis. And I realized, I don't really want to use a battle board in minis particularly. I'm not fussed. Tactical wargaming is a cool thing. Tactical battle gaming stuff is all, but actually this player loves it. And so there are when we get into the bigger fight scenes, I just crack it all out now, for him. And the other guys will kind of roll their eyes a little bit, maybe, although some of them are into it, some that a bit more than others. But
Hmm.
we do that because we've got a player at our table who likes that stuff, for the big battles. And he puts up with us doing it theatre of the mind in our heads, and really rough and everything for the smaller stuff, which is the majority of the time. And we're learning to kind of figure each other out. When one guy, he's really into the narrative. He wants to tell the story of his character every time. So you've got to give him cool things to do so that he can boast about, and give him those opportunities. I've got another guy who's actually just wants to hang with the guys, really. I'm just here and I'm kind of playing along and it's all good. And I want to feel a bit powerful from time to time, but don't make me think. And I've got another guy who wants to solve all of the puzzles and understand everything about the world, and that's great. And he's constantly theorizing about what's going on in the game. And I just write down all his ideas and steal them for later. Yeah. We've got all these different people and different characters. But my point being, you got to feel them out. You got to figure out what it is they like. And the only way is to get at a table with them, start playing and then observe. If there's one bit of, I suppose, one thing I've really sort of learned a lot about over the last few years, it's like just observing people and listening to what they do, and then you can advise them on, like, so if someone says to me, I want to run a game for somebody, and that they're into battles and minis and stuff, then there's certain games you point them to, right? But if they're not interested in the rules particularly, there are other games you point them to, and I don't know. It's just, yeah, I do feel though that, we're not talking enough about the diversity of experiences we can have at the table. We're spending far too much talking about the diversity of product.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
and yeah, don't get me wrong, buy stuff if you want to, but I want to play games. And
Yeah, I feel like that's a great topic for the future at some point because I've really been struggling with that concept of we live in a time period where we're surrounded by so much great stuff, and it would be great to have all this stuff, and there's so much love that's put into it, but at the same time it really distracts from this idea that all you need is one thin little manual, and even then that's questionable. Do you even really need the dice? So um like this hobby really is in my mind sort of centered on our imaginations. So it's nice that we have so much input from other people's imaginations, but maybe we're focusing a little less on what we have ourselves. So I think that's a great way to sort of end this. So I just wanted to thank you so much for coming on the show, Che. It's been a real
welcome,
pleasure speaking with you, and
nice to come on.
yeah, man, it's nice to be on the other side, I'm sure. So I've put all of your links in the show notes. If you just wanted to say what the best way you think for people to get in touch with you or to hear about you.
I guess the blog's roleplayrescue.com. And then there's a link there to the podcast. There's a link there to my speak pipe if you want to phone in and moan at me and tell me how wrong I am. Um, you know, yeah, if you want to join the Discord, you can drop me an email, roleplayrescue, all one at pm.me is our email address. So, come and join us if you want. Guys, Patreon, everything's linked from there. So roleplayrescue.com. And um, this is an amateur hobby thing, by the way. It's not um the money on the Patreon pays for the school clubs to have, books basically and dice and stuff like that. And pays for the web space, I suppose. This is not a commercial venture.
Hmm.
What it is, though, is like a beautiful community. Well, I think it's a beautiful community. I'd like to think that it'll keep going after me, if you know what I mean. But who knows?
Well, I'm 100% in agreement with you. I think it's a great community, and I love that that's a big reason why I support you on the Patreon is because I know that you're buying stuff for the kids and getting more people into the hobby and so if I can help in that way, I feel makes me feel good. So you're doing the world a good service.
No, thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to come and talk because I can talk for Britain. So that's good.
Hey, I totally can understand that. All right. Take care and till the next time we meet, plungers up.